So, good afternoon, or possibly good morning or good evening, and welcome to today's virtual retro seminar. My name is Alan Morrison. I'm Professor of Law and Finance at the Business School, the Side Business School, and I'm joined together by Rita Mota, who's the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Business School, who co-convenes these seminars with me, and by our speaker, Celia Moore. Celia is Professor of Organisational Behaviour at Imperial College Business School. She's also an academic fellow of the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, and she sits on the UK's Banking Standard Board Assessment Steering Committee. Her research in general asks how organisations unintentionally facilitate or encourage morally undesirable behaviour and how those phenomena can be addressed. I'm going to turn the floor over to Celia in a moment, but before I do so, I'll make a few quick remarks about the seminar for anyone who hasn't been to one of these before. The retro seminars, that's Reputation, Ethics, Trust and Relationships at Oxford. Retro is a seminar series that's concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organisational life. It's one of a wide range of seminars and conferences that occurs with the generous support of the Centre for Corporate Reputation, which is an interdisciplinary research centre directed by Rupert Younger here at the Side Business School. Retro used to happen in an Oxford seminar room, but it went online as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And Rita and I have both been delighted to learn that the online format can work as well as it appears to do. The talks online have been intellectually exciting, and as an added benefit, we're able to involve a massive variety of people from all over the world who wouldn't be in an Oxford seminar room if that's where we were having these talks. But making it happen is hard work. I'd like to thank all the people who've made an effort to help us today. In particular, thank you to Rupert Younger, who's director of the CCR, to Sarah Livingston, Chris Page and Mark Hughes Morgan. And especially I'm grateful to Rita, who as usual is the real driving force behind these seminars. One of the phenomena with which the Reputation Centre is concerned is the ways in which informal commitment devices operate within organisations, and specifically with the ways in which reputational dynamics and psychological phenomena can be harnessed in order to generate desirable behaviours in the shadow of formal laws that are seldom actually invoked. In fact, we had quite a major conference on exactly that subject over the last weekend. And a natural question about decision-making in the shadow of the formal law is how changes to the formal law affect individual choices. And that's the question, roughly speaking, that Celia's paper addresses today. Specifically, she's going to ask why attempts to close legal loopholes sometimes backfire spectacularly and lead to less rather than more ethical behaviour. Because the seminar is reasonably populous, we have to be slightly formal about the Q&A format. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box and not to the chat, and either Rita or I will relay them to Celia. She's going to speak for about half an hour, during which time she'll respond only to clarification questions if they arise, and after that, I hope we can have, as usual, a reasonably wide-ranging discussion. And also, as usual, we're going to finish bang on time at 5 o'clock. So, Celia, thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor's yours.
Thank you so much for having me. As I just said, there's a very loud chainsaw outside my window, so I'm going to do my best not to get super distracted by it, which is why I'm wearing these ginormous headphones, looking a little funny in this new Zoom world that we live in. I would much rather be in Oxford with you. I see some friendly faces, friendly names in the audience, so thank you guys for coming, and thank you the people that I don't know for coming as well. I have been working on this paper for a couple of years with my colleague Aaron Molliver from London Business School, and it started with an intuition of Aaron's. And let me share my screen and tell you, there we go. I should be more adept at this point in the pandemic. Because I'm really interested in counterintuitive ways that worse behavior can emerge. So this is driven by an intuition that is in that sort of domain. Okay, so we know that agents of social control want people whom are within their remit to behave consistently with their aims. So, governments promulgate laws and regulators derive standards, and organizations issue rules and policies. And the purpose of these regulations is to constrain our behavior so that we behave in a way that's consistent with the intent of the social control agents who promulgate those regulations. But we also know that people like finding ways to circumvent those regulations, especially when on the margin they provide a benefit to the lawbreaker. I'm just going to use the word law. I mean something more broad than that. But it's simpler and has only one syllable. So loopholes are glitches in the formulation of laws that allow clever agents to do things that subvert their intent. My favorite definition of loophole. The legal scholar Katz has written extensively and interestingly on loopholes. So I want to be clear up front that what we're talking about is circumventing laws. So it's not technically, you can make an argument that it isn't misconduct because it is just finding space in the legal landscape that allows for that action. So if there's anyone here in the misconduct literature who tends to write comments in reviews saying, oh, well, that's not misconduct because, you know, technically it was allowed under the law, I acknowledge that, right? But it's still not desirable behavior because it is still behaving in a way that is inconsistent with the intent of the agent of social control who promulgated the rule to begin with. So what do we do about loopholes? Well, both public discourse and lay theory recommends that we close them, right? So there's like a big gaping loophole in tax law. And it's like, if we close the loophole, then the law, tax law will be fairer and will result in more revenue for the government, these kinds of things. So there's a fundamental belief that reducing the repertoire of ways in which people or firms can function in a technically allowable way, but still a way that subverts the intention of the people who promulgate the rules, will decrease the extent to which the law is subverted. Okay, so this is a pretty commonly held reaction. So how do loopholes work? This year has provided lots and lots of ways for us to find loopholes. Dominic Cummings is expert at it. So in the fall, when we started getting to be under stronger restrictions again, restaurants were finding that both they and individuals were finding loopholes in tier 2 COVID rules to allow people to go to their restaurants, right? So there was an exception for business interaction that allowed for people to meet in restaurants that were not part of the same household, right? And restaurants were quite full through people using this loophole, right? So I admit that I actually met Aaron at a restaurant in early October to discuss this paper, technically meeting the loophole exemption for this kind of restaurant meal eating. So there was this loophole for pubs and restaurants that was going to allow them to have more customers, people that have more restaurant meals. And then in a week later, they sort of clarified, they added more language around the rule to clarify for whom the loophole was intended, right? So that clearly specified that it wasn't meant for Aaron and me. It was technically meant for freelancers. So what this has meant in practice is that closing loopholes has increased the number of pages and the complexity of the law enormously, right? So on the top there is a chart of the number of pages in the Code of Federal Regulation over the last 65 years. Yes, it's in thousands of pages. So now it's 180, this is US data, but 180,000 pages of federal regulation in 2019. the average number of pages in each firm's, ooh, there should be an apostrophe there. I hate misused apostrophes. Regulatory filings, you can see that increasing massively as well, which adds complexity. And it's not clear actually whether or not closing loopholes actually reduces subversion of the law. So the question that this paper seeks to answer is, does closing loopholes work? Really hard to get field data on this. So I'm going to present a computer simulation that sort of thinks through a thought experiment on why this might not be true, why the answer to this research question might be no, right? So we agree that closing a loophole will decrease the use of that specific loophole. But one of the things we observe is that many loopholes have several substitutes, right? And I'll give you an example in a second. Tax law is rife with them, right? If you use a legal loophole to reduce the number of pounds or the number of dollars, I'm too North American to not have dollars stuck in my head, the number of dollars that is of your income that is taxable, you only need to find one way to not pay tax on a given dollar of income. Once you've already not paid tax on that dollar, you don't need to find a second way to do it, but there can be multiple ways to not pay tax on a given dollar. It's also true, we know this from research, that individuals derive their understanding about what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior by looking around them. So if a loophole is closed, it will increase the adoption of substitute loopholes, which makes the substitute more prevalent in the population, which will increase its adoption further, right? So the fundamental intuition behind this paper is that for any given way that people want to subvert the law, there will probably be multiple ways of doing it. If we close a loophole in one way, that will drive the users of that loophole to another loophole to use, which will make the extent to which that loophole is used more prevalent, which means that people looking around saying, is it acceptable to use this particular loophole? They'd say yes, because there's more people around using them. Rita, it would be great if you just like give me a wave when I'm getting too close to like give me a 5-minute signal or something like that. Okay, so this is what we did. This is a population of 100 agents. It's very, very simple. Anyone who actually does computer simulation models will find this incredibly overly simplistic. But in the misconduct world, it's pretty rare. So we're trying to do something that is very common in one domain and bring it to another domain. So we have a population of 100 agents, and we assume that they have a relatively normal distribution of morality. And what I mean by this is you can think of it as a threshold. So some people will only engage in an action that is morally problematic if a few people always subvert the law. So here's Ponzi, actual Ponzi. Actually, it's like a week after Madoff died, but that's the actual original Ponzi. So some people will break the law always, will subvert the law no matter what. We'll always look for loopholes. Some people will never break the law. Some people will never use loopholes, right? But most of us are somewhere in the middle. This is what all the research in behavioral ethics says. And we'll engage in a behavior of 40% of the population is using it, or 60% of the population is using it. So we're going to assume, for the purposes of this thought experiment, that there's sort of a normal distribution of morality, moral thresholds in the population. And we can think about those moral thresholds as moral standards that we derive from growing up. Doesn't really matter, but the standards function to limit our morally problematic action. But if we see enough people engaging in that action, then for most of us, unless we're Forrest Gump or Mother Teresa, we will engage in the action if enough people in our universe is engaging in it as well. None of us, however, see the whole population. So within this population of 100 people that we simulate, some people, G here has a relatively small neighborhood. We call it neighborhood. That's the number of people they observe. Z has a relatively large neighborhood. And in this neighborhood of, I think it's 20, I can't remember. in this population where G and Z live, the prevalence of legal subversion represented by these X's is about 1/3. So in these populations, about 1/3 of the population actually subverts the law. But in G's little neighborhood, G would think that 50% of the people are subverting the law, and Z would think that only 1/4 of the people are subverting the law, just as a function of who you're seeing, right? So our peers matter, right? Who we see matters. And the number of people we see is going to differ as a function of who we are and how social we are or whatever. So we have a population of 100 agents with moral thresholds that are normally distributed, and the agents within the populations vary in terms of their neighborhood size. Hopefully you're with me. I can't see anyone except Alan and Rita, so I'm hoping you're with me. If you were actually an audience, I get to see if you look super confused. If there's any clarification questions, let me know, because it's very strange doing this without seeing any faces. So here's a business lunch. This is me and Aaron actually working on this paper outdoors. It was allowed. This was completely within the rules. We were working on this paper in early October, a little bit chilly. So suppose Aaron has a moral threshold of 0.5. This is how it works. Here's Aaron. Aaron wants to meet me for lunch, but there's a couple different ways that he can do this. But in his little neighborhood, he will only engage in the loophole of me for lunch if he sees 50% of the people in his neighborhood doing it. But in his neighborhood, he's got me, who's not doing it yet, and him, and then 25% is using one loophole, and 25% is using another loophole. But say they close the black loophole, say they close the way of socializing in terms of business lunches, and then the only way of seeing friends is group sports, right? So say this red one is, you can socialize with friends in COVID with group sports, and this is you can socialize with friends with business lunches. They close the business lunch loophole. David, who's D, who was using the business lunch loophole to see friends, looks around, and he has a more lax moral threshold than Aaron. He will engage in a behavior if 25% of the people in his neighborhood do it. He already sees 25% of people in his neighborhood doing it. So socializing through group sport. So he engages in that behavior. Then suddenly in Aaron's neighborhood, he sees 50% of the people in his neighborhood engaging in the group sport loophole. So then he starts doing it. And then if I have an even more stringent threshold, 75%, suddenly now I will too. So this is sort of the process that we are thinking happens. Okay, so this is the computer simulation setup. We vary 4 parameters that together will influence whether and how quickly subversion of the law will become widespread. The first is what we said at the beginning with the normal distribution of moral standards. Some will always break the law, some will never break the law. Most of us are in between. And then we vary the number of agents in the population that a focal agent observes. We vary neighborhood size, how social people are. The simulation also varies 2 parameters at the population level. So this is a simulation that takes 100 agents over 100 periods. And we have to start the simulation with a certain baseline prevalence in the population, right? So some things are de novo, like a pandemic, right? We never used to have to look for a loophole to meet our friends for lunch at a restaurant, right? But we had to start somewhere. So we vary the prevalence of the users of different loopholes at baseline. So it's easier to think about this as like forms of tax loopholes, for example. And the other thing that we vary is how the agents in the population are arrayed, right? So we can think about the order of the faces, at least in my version of that you can see in the webinar. So I'm on the top, and then Alan, and then Rita, and then Darius, and then Sarah. But we also will shake that up and have another version of the population where it's Sarah, and then Rita, and then me, and then Chris, and then Darius. Right? So it depends on how the people are arrayed in the population, because that normal distribution won't look like this always. Sometimes a whole bunch of really moral people will be together and all the baddies will be together. Sometimes they'll be evenly distributed through the population, right? So these are the parameters that we vary in a simulation. So what we do is 30 periods in, we close loophole 1. We start with 3 loopholes. 30 periods in, we close loophole 1. 60 periods in, we close loophole 2. And then we see what it looks like at the end of 100 periods, right? We have to stop it at a certain point too. We could let it go forever, but actually it finds an equilibrium. So we ran the simulation 200 times for each of these possible combinations. And I have it in the paper how many times the simulation got run, but it's millions, right? Many, many, many. Whoops. Okay. So here are the observations from the population. It's 423. Okay. And a lot of these observations, and I just want to point out, we know a lot of these observations are going to be true from the different literatures that I didn't go into super thoroughly because I have don't have enough time. But the initial observations from the simulation are obvious if you know literature on diffusion and thresholds. I think what's new and what we'd really like your feedback on in terms of the paper is I have never seen a model like this applied in the domain of misconduct or morally problematic behavior. I think it's a very organizationally relevant question, whether closing loopholes works. So I want to apply these sort of observations from classic sociological literature to a really specific domain to try and, provide insights to a given pasture that's relevant to me. Okay, so what we see in these figures is we only really need to look at the ones on the left. The proportion of people in the population using either any of loopholes 1, 2, and 3 throughout a given iteration of the simulation. So this is where everybody in the simulation has a neighborhood size of 5, and the initial adopters of loopholes 1, 2, and 3 are 5 people, 13 people, and 9 people. Okay, so you can see that in this case, subversion will always increase from baseline until it reaches the threshold of everybody's moral thresholds in the population. And then at period 30, it closes a loophole and there will be a decrease. Now, how big that decrease is varies according to the simulation, but every time you close a loophole, it's the usage of loopholes overall will go down. But before you close a loophole, it will increase until it reaches some sort of equilibrium for that particular population. Okay. So here are the first 2 observations, not groundbreaking. Gets more interesting in observations 3, 4, and 5. That's all I have. I just have three more. So I think I'll be not too bad with time. The first of the 3 primary observations we want to make with this simulation is that closing loopholes can backfire and actually increase subversion over time, and can even trigger a runaway process of widespread adoption, right? So we see that sometimes it just increases and it reaches a steady state, right? This is where you have a neighborhood size of 10 and the initial adopters are 11, 7, and 7 of loopholes 1, 2, and 3, respectively. But in this case, a neighborhood size of 10 and initial adopters of 10, 10, and 10, you see what happens, right? It goes up until it reaches its first equilibrium. They close one loophole at period 30 and it goes down. People can see my cursor, right? You can see my cursor? Yeah, okay. So usage of loopholes overall goes down period 30 and again at period 60. But at period 60, when it goes down, however the population is arrayed in that particular population, that particular simulation, when people look up in period 61, look up and look around and to observe whether or not loophole usage meets their threshold, I'm acting like they're agentic and they're not. They're just ones and zeros, but you know what I mean. Depending on how they're arrayed, you can sometimes get this runaway process where by the end of the simulation, 100% of the people are using the loophole. This is not what we would necessarily predict if we're just thinking about closing loopholes as a, oh, look, there's an open door. You close it. You can't go through it anymore. Therefore, you will decrease subversion of the law. The fourth observation, the fourth and fifth are different variations on the same thing, which is that the final outcomes of these simulations vary really widely, even under nearly identical starting conditions. Okay, so this figure here shows on the x-axis the range of the number of initial adopters. Right. So in this simulation, there are 0 initial adopters of any loopholes, which basically means that there's just no way to subvert the law. So that universe stays pretty moral, this one over here. But as soon as you get between like about 5 and 22 initial adopters, the outcome, so the y-axis here is at the end of the 100 periods, what proportion of the population is using a loophole. You see that they go up to near the top, 80% or more, or yeah, 4, 6, 8, 80% or more, and can be as low as 10%, right? So this is the same thing happens with neighborhood size differences. So in this middle range, you end up with giant differences at the end of the simulation. So what this suggests is that we tend to think of the actions we take as being more one-to-one causal of final population level outcomes than is true. What we observe in both this figure and this figure, so this figure looks at the neighborhood size, initial adopters, and this one looks at neighborhood size of the people in the simulation, is that you can end up with really, really radically different outcomes just as a function of who people see and how many people there were to see subverting the law to begin with, right? So we tend to think of a classic example of a terrible company like Enron. You think, well, that had to have happened, and then we seek reasons for why that did happen. Oh, it was Ken Lay, it was skilling, it was, the way that their incentive system was created. But actually, that could have happened, and it could have not happened as a function of like who you looked around to see and how many people you observed subverting what types of rules or regulations. Right? It could have ended up Enron being a very virtuous organization, or that's sort of the type of conclusion we'd like to at least think about as a function of this simulation. Okay, so just questions, because this is still a work in progress. We know that much of this is known in the literature on diffusion and thresholds, right? But that literature has not really been applied that thoroughly to our understanding of misconduct or subversion of the law. And moreover, that literature doesn't tend to examine what happens when options for action are eliminated. Usually diffusion or threshold models just look at what happens and how these runaway processes play out. Doesn't look at what happens after avenues for action are removed. But is this paper interesting? Are these observations new, especially to the people who are in the areas of misconduct and legal subversion, or does it sound too much like what we already know? So that's sort of the questions that I'd like the audience to help us think through. And I think I'm sort of, out of time-ish. And I believe, Alan, you and Rita moderate the questions now. Is that what happens?
That's exactly what happens. Thank you very much, Celia, for a really interesting and fun talk. I have a bunch of questions. there are a few questions appearing in the chat. While the chat the Q&A, not the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A. And yes, Darius, please do. As the Q&A populates, I'm going to take advantage of my convener's chair to ask you a couple of questions. One question I have is a question of moral thresholds are right at the heart of this, right? This stuff works if people view morality in terms of these thresholds. So a sort of basic trivial question is whether this is empirically valid. A more interesting question for me is whether these things are subject to manipulation. So if people have moral thresholds, I presume that they vary by the nature of the loophole. So perhaps I might be willing to drive my car over the speed limit if everyone else is doing it. I'm highly unlikely to go on a murder spree because other people are doing so. And I wonder if the way that policy is framed and explained might actually affect thresholds and therefore affect the diffusive processes you're talking about. Is that a reasonable thing to imagine?
Yeah, so there's two aspects of thresholds that we have some empirical evidence about, right? So I don't think that thresholds, moral thresholds, are as specific as, like, if I'm making a decision about whether or not I'm going to push the boundaries of lockdown restrictions, I'm not like looking around and thinking like, do 60% of my friends do this? Do 75% of my friends do that? No one calculates it like that.
No.
So it's a bit removed from reality in that respect. But there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we make moral decisions and moral judgments in part as a function of how prevalent we observe a practice to be, right? So like a very trivial example is I spent 5 years in New York City. It made me very tolerant of jaywalking, right? I spent all those years, like you can't walk in New York City anywhere unless you jaywalk. You can't get anywhere. So it just, literally 100% of the population is jaywalking. So it just becomes sort of a norm. And my threshold for jaywalking is very low, right? If I go to a country where jaywalking is not normative, then part of me restrains my behavior in some way. Like I found living in Italy, they didn't jaywalk hardly at all, which flabbergasted me because of how Italy works on many other dimensions, but they were very rule bound when it came to traffic and pedestrian walking, perhaps because driving is, it's dangerous to be a pedestrian that jaywalks there. But in that population, I would have been someone with a low moral threshold for jaywalking. The other thing you said is crossing domains. And this simulation is really only meant to refer to subversion within a particular domain, like substituting, one way of socializing in COVID for another, or substituting one way of evading paying income tax on $1 for another, right? It's not like, oh, my threshold for income tax is this, and so therefore I'll go murder someone. We're not talking about crossing.
But there is a framing question even here, right? So if I think of two loopholes as being the same thing, they're both just violating COVID laws, closing one of them will have no effect at all. If I think, because in both, I see 20 people doing it, and then 10 of them go from loophole 1 to loophole 2, and now 20 people are still doing it. So there is some notion of categorization at work here, even within the domain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's actually a key assumption of the model, is that people have to consider them different. People need to consider the two loopholes different. And you can see how that works with tax evasion, right? There are certain types of tax evasion that people consider more or less acceptable as a function of how common they are. Like people, and I never did this because I didn't feel it was right, but I remember many years ago in the UK, people would find ways of incorporating in those UK places that have different tax laws. I can't remember because I never did it, but yeah. No. Isn't it the Channel? It's UK based, wherever those are, Guernsey, I don't know, those islands. But that was quite a normal thing to do. You get socialized into doing that, but that doesn't mean that you would like not report income or like attribute income to a spouse, or the ways that you can do it in other locations. You have to think of them as different enough,
right? But there is some
that the norms of a given one matter.
Right. So, but there is some sort of institutional work here. Categorization has an effect. Anyway, I'll shut up because I've been going on for a while. There's a bunch of interesting questions, and I think Rita has one. Rita, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I do have one, but questions are pouring in, so I think I'll just mix mine with one that's here that is sort of in the same theme. My question was about different market configurations, different industries. Do you think that these conclusions that you arrived at would have to be modified in some way if you thought about, for instance, a monopolistic or oligopolistic market, or about the oil and gas industry as opposed to, I don't know, the food sector? And Andrew Mail has a question here where, well, he starts by saying fascinating and thought-provoking paper and presentation. He's wondering if there is anything in your work that indicates whether behaviors involving adoption of loophole substitutes might be more visible than morally virtuous behavior. And if so, is it possible that people will take greater notice of the loophole substitute rather than less noticeable moral behaviors, even if the loophole or substitute is not as prevalent?
Yeah, I think I have an answer to Andrew's question more than I have an answer to yours. I'm interested in how you think monopolistic versus different market structures would affect this. I have not thought of that, so I'm not going to have a good answer to that question.
That's fine.
But visibility, right? Visibility is baked into a lot of the ideas here, right? That we determine what is appropriate by looking around. I agree with the intuition that I think is underpinning Andrew's question, which is it can be virtuous behavior can be less noticeable. But in either case, either morally virtuous or morally vicious behavior, making it more salient and more visible is going to allow it to have a bigger effect on population level adoption, right? Because it's what we see that is an important driver of everyone's behavior, although to varying degrees.
I guess my question also had to do with visibility in a way, because I guess, I mean, this is just an intuition that if you think about a market where a very small number of people hold most of the visibility, then that might change the dynamics of this type of situation a little bit. I don't know, this is just an intuition, but yeah, it's very interesting. Alan, do you want to...
What I like about that question, actually, it just made me think of, is that our simulation, each of the 100 agents has an equal influence, right? So it depends on your neighborhood size, who you see, but if you've got a neighborhood size of 10, all of those 10 people are equally playing into an agent's decision, an agent's adoption choice, moving from T1 to T+1. But in real life, right, agents don't have equal levels of influence, right? Exactly. I'm much more influenced by what my really close friends do as opposed to my, the people to whom I'm indifferent, but yet are in my neighborhood. So that is a complication to the model that we could add.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting.
And on those lines, I thought this was a bit like those models of associative diffusion in the sociology literature.
Yeah.
You're most similar to, the ones you're most likely to be influenced by. We have a couple of questions about punishment. So Daniel Warren says it's great creative work. She also wonders if you model sanctioning. And Sarah Quinn says, what role does punishment have here? And is there a way, could this help us to think about punishment design? Daniel also says that your theory sounds a bit like Sutherland's differential association theory from criminology theory, and just throws that out as an observation. But on the punishment point, sanctionings, is there something interesting to say here?
Yeah, so I mean, that's another aspect of the model that we could include, right? We could complicate the model by saying that if you're caught using this loophole, then you will be penalized. Generally, the problem with loopholes, I mean, or at least the way that we're thinking about it, is that they are technically allowed within the law. So I saw a question, if I'm allowed to say, at the very beginning from Robin about principles-based regulation. So one of the frames we had for the front end of this paper was about principle versus rule-based regulation. We've sort of taken that, we've removed a little bit of that because we're worried that in the management literature, because it's not, we're not trying to submit it to a law journal, we're trying to submit it to a management journal, and that they'll think of it as too legal. But I completely agree with Robin's question that yes, taking advantage of a loophole is not necessarily illegal. Yes, I agree. But that it's an argument, this is an argument for principles-based regulation. And that if we create too much rules-based regulation, it's impossible to write rules that are perfectly, that map onto the behaviors we want and don't want perfectly. They are always either over or under determinative and always leave room for subversion. Principle-based regulation does that less. It has other problems, has other weaknesses, but it doesn't have this weakness.
So it occurs to me on the basis of what you've just said that this is one way of thinking about what lawyers call the expressive power of the law. When you have a very rules-based legal system, one of the things you're expressing is categories, and then you create the phenomena you're talking about. Whereas a principles-based system says there's only one category, and that means you don't get the sort of diffusion you're talking about.
Yeah.
Anyway, Rita.
I guess this leads us nicely into Robin's other question about self-fulfilling or non-virtuous cycles with an aggressive business culture leading to more prescriptive laws to rein it in, and then more loophole-seeking behavior, etc. Is that what you were sort of implying when you just answered the previous question?
Well, there's another sort of phenomenon that I'm interested in with which is what I was sort of hinting at with those early slides on how the amount of regulation is increasing, right? The specificity increases, right? So we respond to a gap by like filling in that gap with additional language and clarification. So you end up with like the tax code in the US, it's like this thick. And it was really nice moving to the UK where like basically there's no deductions, there's no whatever. You just pay what you pay. Like it's simple, it's efficient and simple, and whereas the US, there's like 7 million ways to like wiggle around in that tax law, and create advantage for you, and also lots of jobs for lots of people. Mm-hmm. I lost my train of thought, but yes. I've lost her.
Well, we were just talking about vicious circles where you have subversive behavior, attempts to control that behavior, which in turn leads to more subversive behavior and so on and so forth.
I remember that. So when I think that when regulation gets to be too complicated, people will subvert it more.
Okay.
That's a different intuition that is not tested in this paper, but there's a certain point where it's like, oh my God, I can't even like, no, there's way too much complexity here. And it's so complex that no one can actually effectively police it. The sanctions get less effective because like there's so much you've got to check to make sure that you actually don't meet any of the legally allowable courses of action, that I think that there ends up being more subversion of the law. This was my experience in Italy with the number of bureaucratic rules, and that just everyone ignores all of them, right? Not everyone ignores all of them. Many people ignore many of them. Yes,
that's very common in my own home country too. Alan, did you want to ask another one?
Sure. I'm going to ask a question that Gregory Clark has posed. He asked the question in a very technical way, reflecting his very technical background. I'm going to ask his question and then rephrase it in my dumb way. He says, what about adding a capacity to your model so that each loophole adding capacities to each loophole so that after it's crossed so many times it breaks. So if I use a loophole X times, it just automatically closes. So in other words, is that, I mean, I wonder if that's a feasible policy prescription, because you'd have to actually observe the breaking of the loophole. And whether people's anticipate, and of course it'd be a much more complicated model, whether anticipating this sort of behavior would affect choices. And the dumb question I have that's related is whether it would be interesting to have laws that rescinded themselves after a certain amount of time. You know, people talk about this a lot in the legal literature, which would kind of, you know, this loophole is going to go away after a bit. Presumably in your model, that would result, would that reverse the process, or is it too late by then?
So, I mean, it is a complicated question. I don't know what capacity weights are, but I think this addresses that question, which is after it's crossed so many times it breaks. What that reminds me of in the conversations I've had with Arne about this paper is that when a loophole use becomes really prevalent, and we sort of see this in the model in a way, agents of social control become more aware that their regulation is being subverted. So then they become more likely to close it. Right. But I think that can go two ways, right? Either it's like, oh my God, everyone's using this loophole, this business lunch loophole, we've got to close the business lunch loophole. And then it becomes more likely to get closed because so many people are using it. Or it goes the other way, which is so many people are using the loophole that the agent of social control gives up. And it's like, oh my God, this is too much of a norm. We just got to, we can't regulate it. And then they eliminate the law. So I think in real life, it can go both ways. I think you could simulate both as well. But that's
so
Arne's job.
The path dependency question I had was if you reopen loopholes after you've closed them, does the moral turpitude that's introduced in your model go away? And I suspect it doesn't, but I'm not sure. Because people have now crossed the threshold. There's no way of reversing this behavior, right?
Yeah, well, this is it, the runaway process that we are trying to show as our primary results. I don't want to call it a result because I know it's not empirical. It's almost, we're actually debating about, like, is this sort of a theory paper with the simulation as sort of simulated evidence? We can't quite figure out how to pitch it. That, I mean, once everyone's adopted it, then it becomes hard to restrict the behavior. It is simple, right? That in our model, if you close it, then you just can't use it anymore. It doesn't go underground. It doesn't, you know, and real life is also not like that. Real life is not like computer simulations in many, many ways.
Early life's not that simple, yeah. Okay, Rita.
Sure. There's a question here from Don Lang that's pretty interesting. So Don is asking, if social proof drives diffusion of subversion, maybe observers are imitating generalized subversion of a specific rule or law rather than a specific method of subversion of that rule or law. What do you think?
So hi, Don. Don emailed and said he was going to be here. And hi, Danielle. So I'm not sure how to respond to that question, because if you think about, you know, the two main types of examples I've been using in this talk, if you're going to not pay tax on a given dollar of income, there needs to be a specific way that you're doing that. They're not like generalized, like, I've got 7,000 of my dollars that I've earned that I've just decided I'm not paying tax on in just a general, like, I don't feel like that's how it works. Or even if I'm going to socialize with someone, it's got to be through some means, right? Either like I hire them so that we can then meet inside for a meeting, or there's got to be a way that you execute the legal subversion. So maybe, I mean, he could ask another question about like, what would general subversion look like? What would generalized subversion look like? What actions would those be?
If I read it correctly, I would say generalized subversion would be just, for instance, avoiding income tax, whereas a specific method of subversion would be, okay, so I'm going to incorporate in this country because the tax rate is lower, or I can take advantage of this bilateral treaty or something like that.
So this actually, Dawn's question then goes back to Alan's question about, are they in the same category or not?
Yes.
Right. And in this model, we assume that they are within the same domain, but are in different categories.
Okay.
I don't know of any evidence that speaks to how people view it. And if they see it as, I mean, I do think there's lots of people who are like, how can I reduce my income tax? But then in the execution, you've got to execute it using a specific category of that generalized type of subversion.
Yeah.
It's going back again to like what we want the main takeaway of this paper to be is that closing opportunities for legal subversion sort of shunts people into other courses of action that make it more observable and therefore more normative.
Mm.
Okay, we're running a bit low on time. I'm going to just read out for the benefit of people who can't see the Q&A, a comment by Holger Lensk, which says that a good example of the phenomenon you're talking about is CumEx transactions in Germany, where people get tax redemptions to the sale of stock, and repeated attempts by the legislature there to close loopholes apparently merely served to make the practice more widespread. So he views that as a pretty good example of the phenomenon you're talking about. I wanted to ask, well, I guess I have two remaining questions and you can decide which one to answer in the last 5 minutes. I was keen to know whether you think this is actually a model of organizations at all. It doesn't feel like one, except that insofar as organizations maybe create networks. And my other question was, could we use this to understand how big technological changes that appear to have nothing to do with morality affect moral behavior? So I'm thinking about bowling alone and phenomenon like this. So stuff that technological shocks, like, you know, the television or something that shrinks our social circles and stops us going out to bowling clubs, might have an effect on our network sizes, or technological shocks like Twitter that give us enormous networks of people we talk to might increase them. And is it conceivable that technology therefore has a kind of indirect effect on the phenomenon you're talking about?
So technological shocks, when you talk about bowling alone, what that means to me is like neighborhood size.
Right.
Yeah. So
that could be affected simply by stuff that's unrelated to this law, just technology that makes us stay home and watch the box or something.
But it affects how we view what others are doing. So it affects our understanding of prevalence. Right.
Yes.
And so what the simulation shows is that the bigger our neighborhoods are, the more representative the prevalence in that neighborhood is going to be reflective of the actual population prevalence, right? So you end up with, when you've got simulations with really big neighborhood sizes, you end up with final outcomes that are closer to what the population baseline prevalence was, right? Because you're seeing a broader swath of the population. It's where neighborhood sizes are sort of in the middle that you end up with these really big ranges, because it depends on the distribution of who you see and how biased that sample is of the general population. So one of the other findings that I didn't talk about is that if you have a really well-placed, highly moral agent, they can operate as like a finger in the dike, right? But without flooding the claims, like it actually stops the flood, right? Because it just represents a place where no one else, because they have a high moral threshold, and I don't have a good way of describing this, but it just stops the diffusion, because they're like, I'm just not gonna.
Right.
Yeah.
There are two really good questions that have just appeared in the chats that we haven't got time to address, but I'm just going to read them out so that people in the audience know what they are. Paul Dunn observes that neighborhoods are not randomly distributed, they're endogenous. Criminals hang out together. And that presumably, this is a sort of Ron Burt type observation, that shape of networks is something that's endogenous, and maybe that'll be something to think about. The last observation I'll make, and I'm going to give you a minute to respond to it, Celia, before we stop, is from Renato Reis, who says your model suggests that there's no point in closing loopholes. It's one-sided, right? So we should have as many loopholes as possible, and we should make sure that people can.
No, I don't think that's not the conclusion. The conclusion is that closing loopholes doesn't have the necessarily simplistic, solely positive effect that we think.
In your simulation, it never has a positive effect, right?
No, it's in some it goes down, but it doesn't always.
Okay, right, yeah.
Right, there are many worlds in which it does go down, but when it doesn't, it can sometimes go like whoosh. That's the main thing. But I just want to say one really quick thing about criminals hanging together and normal people. Normal people, criminals are normal too. Criminals are normal people. Criminals and non-criminals hang out together is when you have really segregated neighborhoods, right, with all the criminals together, then you don't end up with widespread subversion, because not enough people have diverse enough neighborhoods to observe enough people to cross their thresholds.
So what you then need is network brokers to spread criminal tendencies.
And there are always network brokers.
Right, yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you, Celia. I really enjoyed that. And I hope our audience did. It was fascinating. We always stop on time. It's exactly 5 o'clock, so I'm going to stop now. And thank you very much for a fascinating seminar.
Thank you, all the people I couldn't see. Yeah. Your names on the side. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Celia. And everyone, please don't forget to register for the next retro seminar, which will be in 2 weeks. And our speaker will be Danielle Efron. So please register and come. It'll be amazing for sure.